September 1st, 1939.
The morning sun barely broke through the horizon when the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Polish fortifications at Westerplatte.
But this wasn't just another naval bombardment.
This was the opening shot of something the world had never seen before.
Within hours, over 3 million German troops were flooding across the Polish border from 3 directions.
Tanks rolled forward in massive columns.
Stuka dive bombers screamed from the sky.
And the Polish defenders, brave as they were, found themselves fighting an enemy that moved faster than anything they'd prepared for. The world scrambled to find a word for what they were witnessing.
Western journalists, watching in shock as Poland collapsed in just over a month, coined a term that would define an era: Blitzkrieg.
Lightning war.
But here's what makes this story fascinating.
The Germans themselves never actually called it that in their official doctrine.
They used the term Bugangskrieg, or War of Movement. Yet Blitzkrieg captured something essential about what was happening. Because what the world saw in Poland, and later in France, wasn't just fast warfare.
It was a complete revolution in how wars were fought.
Before we dive deeper into how Blitzkrieg changed everything, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this channel has reached. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into military history, hit that subscribe button.
We've got plenty more stories like this coming your way.
Now, to understand why Blitzkrieg was so revolutionary, we need to go back to 1918.
Germany had just lost the First World War, and the experience was seared into the national consciousness. The Western Front had devolved into a nightmare of trench warfare. Millions of men lived in mud-filled ditches, facing machine gun fire and artillery barrages. At the Battle of the Somme alone, over 1 million soldiers from all sides became casualties in just 141 days.
The fighting was static, brutal, and seemingly endless.
Soldiers would attack across no man's land, gain a few hundred yards of ground,
and then watch as the enemy counterattacked to take it back.
Every nation that fought in World War I walked away with the same determination: never again. But they each had very different ideas about how to avoid repeating that nightmare.
The British decided to invest heavily in air power, believing they could simply fly over the trenches and bomb the enemy into submission.
The French, traumatized by the devastation on their soil, built the Maginot Line, a series of 58 underground fortresses along the German border.
It was essentially a permanent, heavily fortified version of a trench.
But the Germans, they took a completely different approach.
They decided they were going to blast straight through any defensive line with a new kind of warfare that emphasized speed, shock, and coordination.
The architect of this new doctrine wasn't Hitler, despite what Nazi propaganda later claimed. It was a group of forward-thinking German officers led by General Heinz von Seeckt and, most importantly, a brilliant tactician named Heinz Guderian. Now, Guderian is one of those historical figures who's absolutely fascinating.
He wasn't from some aristocratic military family. He was just a professional soldier who became obsessed with a simple question: how do we avoid getting stuck in trenches again? During the 1920s and 1932, while the Treaty of Versailles had severely limited Germany's military capabilities, Guderian studied everything he could about mechanized warfare.
He traveled to Sweden to observe tank battalions.
He even visited a secret tank testing facility in the Soviet Union, where Germany was covertly developing armored vehicles.
And he read everything the British and French military theorists were writing about tanks.
Officers like J.F.
C. Fuller and Basil Littlehart in Britain, and Charles de Gaulle in France, had been proposing revolutionary ideas about mobile warfare.
But here's the irony: their own countries largely ignored them. In 1937, Guderian published a book called Panzer, which became a military bestseller.
The book laid out a radical vision. Don't use tanks to support infantry attacks. Use tanks as the main attacking force, supported by motorized infantry and aircraft. Create independent armored divisions that could punch through enemy lines and drive deep into their territory, disrupting command centers, supply lines, and communications before the enemy could even react. It was the military equivalent of a boxer going straight for a knockout punch instead of slowly wearing down the opponent.
Hitler loved Guderian's ideas, though not necessarily for the right reasons. In early 1934, Guderian organized a demonstration of Panzer tactics for Hitler, and the FHR was mesmerized. He reportedly kept saying, "That's what I need. That's what I need." Why? Because Hitler understood that a quick, decisive war would be far less expensive than a prolonged conflict.
Germany didn't have the resources for another grinding war of attrition. They needed to win fast, and Guderian was offering him the blueprint. But what exactly made Blitzkrieg so different?
Let me break down the core elements.
First, concentration of force.
Instead of spreading tanks evenly along a front line, the Germans would mass them at a single point, the Schwerpunkt, or center of gravity. They'd concentrate overwhelming firepower at one weak spot in the enemy's defenses. Second, speed and mobility. Once they broke through, Panzer divisions wouldn't stop to consolidate.
They'd race ahead, sometimes advancing 50 to 60 miles in a single day. Third, combined arms coordination.
Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft all worked together in perfect synchronization.
And fourth, the psychological element. The Stuka dive bombers weren't just weapons, they were psychological warfare.
They were equipped with sirens that created that distinctive screaming sound as they dove.
The sound alone was meant to terrify and disorient defenders.
But here's what made it all possible: radio communications. This might sound boring, but it was absolutely crucial. German tanks, even the smaller ones, were equipped with two-way radios.
Field commanders could communicate in real time, adapting to changing battlefield conditions instantly.
The French, by contrast, often relied on messengers and had inadequate radio equipment.
The French commander-in-chief, General Maurice Gamelin, didn't even have a telephone at his headquarters in Paris. Think about that. While German panzer commanders were coordinating attacks by radio from their tank turrets, the French High Command was relying on couriers on motorcycles. The Germans also developed something called mission-type orders, or Auftragstactik.
Instead of micromanaging every decision, German commanders told their subordinates what objective to achieve, but let them figure out how to do it. This created a flexible, adaptive military where field officers could exploit opportunities as they appeared. Hitler, in the early days of the war, largely trusted his generals like Guderian and Erwin Rommel to make tactical decisions on the ground. This flexibility was key to Blitzkrieg's success.
So when September 1st, 1939 arrived, Poland became the testing ground. The attack was meticulously planned.
Two army groups, North and South, invaded simultaneously.
Army Group South's primary objective was Warsaw, the Polish capital. The Luftwaffe immediately targeted Polish airfields, destroying much of the Polish air force on the ground in the first days.
Polish forces fought tenaciously. Make no mistake about that.
At the Battle of Bzura, Polish forces launched a major counterattack that initially decimated 2 German divisions and captured 3,500 German prisoners.
Polish cavalry units, despite the myth, weren't charging tanks with lances.
They were actually quite effective in reconnaissance and harassment, but they were facing an enemy that could move faster, hit harder, and coordinate better than anything they'd prepared for.
Within a week, German forces had covered 200 miles and reached the outskirts of Warsaw.
By September 8th and 9th, they began their assault on the capital.
The Polish defenders held out bravely, but by September 17th, something unexpected happened.
The Soviet Union invaded from the east. Stalin, operating under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sent the Red Army across Poland's eastern border.
Polish forces now faced a two-front invasion. Warsaw held out until September 27th before officially falling. The last Polish forces surrendered on October 6th.
The cost was devastating.
Poland suffered around 66,000 dead, 134,000 wounded, and approximately 690,000 taken prisoner when you include both German and Soviet captures.
The Germans lost about 16,000 killed and 30,000 wounded.
But they'd conquered an entire nation in just over a month. The world was stunned. Military analysts across Europe tried to understand what had just happened. Some convinced themselves that Poland had simply been unprepared, poorly equipped, caught off guard.
They told themselves it couldn't happen to them. They were catastrophically wrong. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Full Gelb, Case Yellow, against Western Europe.
The target wasn't just France.
It was the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg as well. And the plan was brilliant in its deception. The Germans knew the Allies expected them to attack through Belgium, just as they had in World War I.
So they made it look like that's exactly what they were doing. Army Group E under General Fiedler von Bock invaded the Netherlands and Belgium with 3 panzer divisions and significant airborne forces.
The British and French, following their PI-arranged plans, immediately rushed their best forces north into Belgium to meet this attack.
But that was exactly what the Germans wanted.
Because the real punch was coming somewhere else entirely.
Army Group A, under General Gerd von Brunstedt, with 7 Panzer divisions and 45 divisions total, was advancing through the Ardennes forest.
The Allies had convinced themselves the Ardennes was impenetrable to tanks. The terrain was too rough, the roads too narrow, the forests too dense.
Major General Heinz Guderian would prove them wrong.
On May 12th and 13th, Guderian's panzers emerged from the Ardennes at Sedan, the same place where Germany had won a decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The crossing of the Meuse River at Sedan was one of the most important moments of the entire war. The Germans concentrated overwhelming force at this single point. Stuka dive bombers pounded French positions in what pilots called rolling attacks. Wave after wave of aircraft kept French defenders pinned down, while German engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river. French troops, many of them reservists who'd been told the Ardennes was impassable, found themselves facing the full fury of a panzer assault supported by hundreds of aircraft. The French line broke, and once it broke, Guderian didn't wait for permission to exploit it. He just went. His tanks raced west toward the English Channel, covering 50 to 60 miles per day. They were moving so fast that the German high command got nervous.
Hitler himself issued several halt orders, worried that the panzers were too exposed, that their flanks were vulnerable, that they'd be cut off.
But Guderian kept pushing. He would famously send back reports claiming he'd lost radio contact with headquarters, then continue his advance. By May 20th, just 10 days after the invasion began, German panzers reached the English Channel at Abbeville.
They'd cut the Allied armies in two.
The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, found themselves trapped in a pocket around the port city of Dunkirk. The Germans had achieved in weeks what they'd failed to do in 4 years during World War I.
The Dunkirk evacuation from May 26 to June 4th was both a disaster and a miracle. Around 338,000 British and French troops were evacuated across the Channel, saving the core of the British Army, but they left behind all their heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, trucks, everything.
Churchill said it best: "We must be careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." The Germans regrouped and launched the final phase of the campaign, Fall Rot or Case Red, on June 5th.
The remaining French forces tried to establish defensive lines along the Somme and Aisne rivers, but they were shattered and demoralized. Paris was declared an open city on June 13th to spare it from destruction. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. Hitler insisted the ceremony take place in the exact same railway car, at the exact same location in Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I.
It was a deliberate humiliation. The cost of the Battle of France was staggering.
France lost 90,000 dead, 200,000 wounded, and nearly 1.9 million prisoners.
The British lost about 68,000 casualties total. German losses were 29,640 dead and 133,573 wounded. In just 6 weeks, Germany had conquered the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The same France that had held out for 4 years in World War I.
The nation with the largest army in Europe. The nation with better tanks than Germany.
Yes, you heard that right.
French tanks like the Char B1 and Saumur S-35 were actually superior to German panzers in armor and firepower. But they were used incorrectly, dispersed among infantry units instead of concentrated in armored divisions. The world was in shock.
How had Germany done this?
Nazi propaganda, of course, credited Hitler as a military genius, the inventor of Blitzkrieg. Newsreels showed him standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, the conqueror of Europe.
But the truth was more complex.
Blitzkrieg worked because of superior tactics, better communications, flexible command structures, and the element of surprise.
The Germans had also gotten lucky. Several times during the French campaign, there were moments when the Allies could have cut through the German spearheads and turned the tide. But confusion, poor communication, and slow decision-making prevented them from acting quickly enough.
Hitler now controlled Western Europe. Britain stood alone.
And Hitler made a decision that would prove fatal. He believed he could afford to turn east.
On June 22, 1941, exactly 1 year after France surrendered, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union.
It would be the largest invasion in human history. Over 3.8 million Axis troops, supported by 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft, attacked along an 180-mile front. Hitler expected another quick victory. He told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down."
he believed the Soviet Union would collapse within 6 to 8 weeks. 3 army groups set out for 3 different targets. Army Group North heading for Leningrad, Army Group Center aiming for Moscow, and Army Group South pushing toward Kiev and the resource-rich Ukraine.
The strategy was the same one that had worked so brilliantly in France: win by not fighting.
Move so fast that the enemy couldn't organize a defense. And at first, it worked perfectly.
The advance exceeded all expectations. Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared.
Stalin had ignored numerous intelligence warnings about the coming invasion.
Within the first week, German forces destroyed nearly 4,000 Soviet aircraft, many of them on the ground. They advanced 200 miles into Soviet territory.
Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in massive encirclement battles.
By December, German troops had taken over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Most of these men would die in captivity from starvation, exposure, and deliberate neglect. But something was going wrong. The Soviet Union wasn't collapsing. Despite catastrophic losses, Soviet resistance remained fierce. Stalin rallied his people with cause to defend Mother Russia, framing the war as a patriotic struggle for survival. Soviet factories, many of them relocated east of the Ural Mountains beyond German reach, began producing tanks and weapons at an incredible rate.
Tank production jumped from 4,800 in 1941 to over 24,000 in 1942. German supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive Russian roads, began to break down.
Tanks ran out of fuel, ammunition ran short,
and then winter arrived.
The brutal Russian winter of 1941 to 1942 hit the Germans like a hammer. They were still wearing summer uniforms.
Their vehicles weren't winterized. The oil in their tanks froze.
Soldiers suffered from frostbite. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped and trained for winter warfare, launched a massive counter-offensive in December 1941. Just as German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow, a mere 20 miles from the Kremlin, the Germans were forced onto the defensive for the first time. Operation Barbarossa had failed.
By the end of January 1942, Germany had lost 918,000 men, nearly 29% of the invasion force.
The Soviets had suffered over 3 million casualties, but the critical difference was this: the Soviets could replace their losses. Germany could not. The Blitzkrieg that had worked so brilliantly in Poland and France had failed in the vast expanses of Russia.
Why did it fail?
First, the distances were too vast. France is about 210,000 square miles.
The European portion of the Soviet Union is over 1.5 million square miles. German supply lines simply couldn't keep up. Second, Soviet resistance was far more determined than expected.
Despite terrible leadership in the early stages and devastating losses, Soviet soldiers kept fighting.
Third, Soviet resources were far deeper than German intelligence had estimated.
Stalin could keep bringing up fresh divisions from the interior. Fourth, the weather and terrain. The Russian mud in autumn and the brutal cold in winter were unlike anything the Germans had faced in Western Europe.
And finally, Hitler's strategic indecision. He kept changing objectives, pulling forces from one front to another, preventing any single thrust from achieving a decisive breakthrough. Blitzkrieg as a doctrine required quick victories and short campaigns.
It was never designed for a prolonged war of attrition. Germany didn't have the manpower or industrial capacity to sustain long campaigns against multiple great powers simultaneously.
Once the initial shock wore off, once the enemy adapted and learned how to counter the tactics, Blitzkrieg lost its effectiveness.
The Allies learned from their defeats.
By 1944, during Operation Cobra after D-Day, American forces were using Blitzkrieg-style tactics themselves.
Concentrated armor, close air support, rapid advances, and flexible command structures. The Soviets, too, adapted German tactics, using massive tank formations in their offensives from 1943 onward. Ironically, by the end of the war, it was the Allies using combined arms warfare to crush Germany. So what's the legacy of Blitzkrieg?
First, it revolutionized military thinking.
The principles of combined arms warfare, the concentration of force, the emphasis on speed and mobility, the integration of air and ground forces. All of these remain fundamental to modern military doctrine. When the United States developed its airland battle doctrine in the 1980s during the Cold War, it was essentially an evolved form of Blitzkrieg adapted for modern technology.
The 1991 Gulf War saw coalition forces use Blitzkrieg-style tactics to devastating effect against Iraq. Second, Blitzkrieg showed the critical importance of communications and coordination. Modern networked warfare, where every unit from aircraft to tanks to infantry is connected by digital communications, is the direct descendant of Guderian's radio-equipped Panzers. Third, it demonstrated that technology alone isn't enough.
The French had better tanks in 1940. They had a larger army.
But they lost because they used their resources incorrectly. Doctrine, training, and leadership matter as much as hardware.
And fourth, Blitzkrieg's ultimate failure in the Soviet Union taught an important lesson. There is no such thing as a perfect military strategy.
Every tactic has counters. Every doctrine has weaknesses.
The Germans believed they'd found a way to win wars quickly and decisively. But when they faced an enemy with vast space, massive resources, and the will to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting, Blitzkrieg couldn't deliver victory.
Here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Blitzkrieg. Its human cost. Yes, it won quick victories. Yes, it was tactically brilliant. But it also led to immense civilian suffering. The German invasion of Poland wasn't just a military campaign.
It was accompanied by deliberate atrocities against civilians. The bombing of cities like Wielu on the first day of the war killed 150 civilians and destroyed 75% of the city. This wasn't collateral damage.
It was intentional terror bombing. The Luftwaffe deliberately targeted civilian populations to spread panic and destroy morale.
And as German forces advanced, special SS units called Einsatzgruppen followed behind, executing Polish intellectuals, clergy, and civilians. This was part of Hitler's stated goal from the beginning: the physical destruction of Poland as a nation. Operation Barbarossa was even worse.
Hitler's Barbarossa jurisdiction decree gave German soldiers legal immunity for crimes against Soviet civilians.
The invasion was explicitly framed as a war of annihilation, not just conquest.
So when we talk about Blitzkrieg, we need to remember that it wasn't just a military innovation.
It was part of a brutal, expansionist war that cost tens of millions of lives. The tactical brilliance doesn't erase the moral horror. Where does Blitzkrieg fit in the broader story of military history?
In many ways, it was the culmination of ideas that had been developing since the late 19th century. The concept of decisive maneuver warfare, of seeking the enemy's weak point and exploiting it ruthlessly,
goes back to military theorists like Karl von Clausewitz and Helmuth von Moltke. The use of new technology to achieve old strategic goals of encirclement and annihilation has precedence in every era. What made Blitzkrieg unique was its synthesis.
It brought together tanks, aircraft, motorized infantry, and radio communications into a coherent system that could be executed at the operational level. But it also showed the limits of military innovation.
Technology and tactics can give you an advantage, sometimes a decisive one, but they can't compensate for fundamental strategic mistakes.
Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain, his declaration of war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, his refusal to allow tactical withdrawals or strategic flexibility.
These strategic failures doomed Germany regardless of how brilliant the tactics were.
The generals who developed Blitzkrieg, men like Guderian, were products of a particular military culture.
The German general staff system emphasized professional education, wargaming, and continuous learning from exercises and real combat. After World War I, the Germans spent the 1920s and 1930 seconds studying what went wrong,
experimenting with new ideas, and preparing for the next conflict. This culture of innovation and adaptation was key to their early success, but it was also limited by its political context.
The Nazi regime's ideological goals and Hitler's strategic decisions ultimately undermined military effectiveness.
One of the fascinating counterfactuals is this: what if Germany had stuck to a purely defensive strategy after conquering Poland?
What if Hitler had negotiated from a position of strength instead of launching offensive after offensive?
Blitzkrieg gave Germany stunning tactical victories, but it also encouraged Hitler to think he was invincible. Each success led to more ambitious plans, until finally Germany was fighting the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire simultaneously.
No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome those odds. Historians still debate whether Blitzkrieg was really a revolutionary new form of warfare or simply an evolution of existing concepts.
Some argue it was just traditional German military thinking, emphasis on maneuver and decisive battle, adapted for mechanized warfare. Others point out that the term Blitzkrieg itself was more of a journalistic invention than an official doctrine.
The Germans never published a manual called How to Conduct Blitzkrieg. The tactics emerged organically from exercises, experiments, and the practical experience of commanders like Guderian. What's undeniable is the impact.
The campaigns of 1939 to 1941 shocked the world and forced every military to rethink how wars would be fought in the modern era.
The age of static defensive lines was over. Mobility, coordination, and rapid exploitation of opportunities became paramount. The lessons of Blitzkrieg influenced military thinking for the rest of the 20th century and continue to shape doctrine today. In the end, Blitzkrieg's story is one of brilliant innovation meeting fundamental limitations.
It changed warfare forever, but it couldn't change the basic reality that wars are ultimately decided by industrial capacity, resources, and the will to fight. Germany's tactical victories in 1939 and 1940 were real and impressive, but they created an illusion of German invincibility that Hitler and his generals began to believe.
That illusion shattered on the frozen approaches to Moscow in December 1941, and Germany spent the next 3.5 years fighting a losing war. The lightning war that promised quick, decisive victory had instead led Germany into exactly the kind of prolonged multi-front war of attrition it was designed to avoid.
The Blitzkrieg worked until it didn't, and when it failed catastrophically.
That's perhaps the most important lesson. There are no perfect strategies, no tactics that guarantee victory against every enemy in every situation. Military history is full of brilliant innovations that worked until someone figured out how to counter them.
The key is adaptability.
The willingness to learn from both success and failure.
Blitzkrieg gave us spectacular battles and stunning victories. It revolutionized how we think about warfare. But it also reminds us that wars are won by more than just tactics and technology. They're won by strategy, resources, alliances, and ultimately by the resilience and determination of entire nations.
The lightning war was brilliant, but lightning doesn't last forever.
Eventually, the storm passes, and you're left dealing with the aftermath. And that's the story of Blitzkrieg. The lightning war that changed everything, worked perfectly until it didn't, and taught us lessons we're still learning today.